Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Can't believe it's almost Thanksgiving already. I'm Steve Addicott. As we do many times, we like to share important lessons learned from key conference events in our industry. So today we want to talk about European Association of Test Publishers and the last month's conference on statistical detection of potential test fraud. I am very pleased to be joined by Dr. John Fremer and Dennis Maynes, our Chief Scientist. So they're going to share their key takeaways. Before we get cracking, as we get cracking, we've got a poll that I want to launch, and that is this question. What was your involvement in these two recent conferences? Did you attend neither, maybe one but not the other? So if you just take a minute and let us know, we're eager to see what people were able to do in terms of participation of these two key industry events. So I can see we've got almost 3/4 of the attendees responding. I'll hold this open for just a couple more seconds. And I'll share the results. And unfortunately, the vast majority of you were not able to attend either conference. So good. I hope that what we share today then is going to be helpful and convey those key lessons learned. All right. So what we want to cover today, John's going to talk about his key takeaways from the European Association of Test Publishers and share 2 of 4 key test security resources that were introduced at the conference. He's also going to talk a little bit about social media. I'm going to talk about some of the other resources that were shared and also some high-level observations from the Conference of Statistical Detection of Potential Test Fraud. Dennis Maynes is going to go a little bit deeper into that conference, as he's been instrumental in both its creation and some of the programming for the last 2 conferences. So now, without further ado, let's go to the next slide, please. I'm going to turn things over to John Fremer. John, we've got your lessons learned from the EATP conference slide up.
Thank you, Steve. I'm pleased to be part of this session. We kind of suspected that there wouldn't be many on our call that had attended EATP, which is the shorthand for it. Next slide, please. It was a wonderful conference, the 5th in a row, and held in Malta. And even if you know people who travel a lot, very likely they've never been to Malta. It's an island nation, kind of 50 miles south of Sicily, Italy, but it's got 1,000+ year history. Knights of Malta, fascinating place. Next slide. I will have 3 slides on the Handbook of Test Security. Just an overview. I think many in the U.S. know more about this book than the folks at the European conference did. What it covers are the kinds of vulnerabilities that you run into regardless of the type of testing you're involved in, the importance of planning, of thinking ahead of how you're going to prevent and detect cheating. If you run into a security breach, how should you deal with it, and what lessons have we learned from past instances of testing misbehavior. We really have quite a wonderful cast of characters who have written chapters for the book. I was a junior editor under Jim Wallach, and feel for me personally it's one of the best pieces of work that I've ever been involved in, and we get very good feedback on it. Next slide. One of the things you'll find in the book are predictions for the future, and if these predictions sound like they might be right, then the book might be of interest to you. If not, then you won't like the book if these predictions don't seem sensible. One is that cheating detection statistical analyses, which are already done in many places, they'll be done routinely. You won't have a testing program that's serious, a certification or licensing program, a state assessment and admissions program. That is becoming the basic thing that you do, just like you do item and test analyses and quality of items and other things. You'll do that. You'll have computer-based testing as the norm. You're in certification, that won't be a surprise. But so far in education, computer-based testing isn't the norm. It's about to become the norm as the consortium-based exams roll out over this year and next year. But right now, probably 80% or more of state assessments and other tests in schools that aren't in a state that happens to have computer-based testing are old-fashioned paper and pencil, get together on Saturday, number 3 pencils, whatever. A number of technology developments will be very important to test security, not just in computer delivery or in scoring or analyses, but in what you have to watch for in the test takers who are way up there in the use of technology, and we have to catch up to them as best we can. Programs will become more international. There'll be part of the work will be done in one country, part in another country, and integration of all those pieces will be important. And lastly, the title won't be test security expert, but test security director, vice president for test security, coordinator of test security is becoming a recognized and valued position. 10 years ago, there were almost none of them. Now you can see ads for them. Next slide. My specific recommendation, if you get the book, is review the table of contents, skim it, earmark sections that you or members of your staff should look to, and then read them only as you're interested in it. I mean, I would love to find people sat down and read it cover for cover, but unless you're a student, who has time to do that? But if you're a serious player in the test development, test program management world, you ought to have this book. And there's no economic gain that's going to come to anybody who had a role in this book. Not the editors, not any of the chapter authors, and Dennis Maynes indeed is one of those authors. We've all agreed to give whatever royalties we get to the National Council on Measurement and Education. So it's not like you'll be enriching any of us if you acquire the book, but I think you will add to your knowledge. Next slide. Another document I want to talk about is the Guidebook for Preventing, Detecting, and Following Up on Test Irregularities. It's a combined piece of work by the Center for Chief State School Officers and a number of states, and it's specifically designed for state assessment directors. When I looked over the attendance list, the projected attendance list for this webinar, it looked like there might have been a dozen or so signed up. So most of you are not working in state assessment, but I still think this book could be valuable. And partly when I get to the end of this set of slides, I think you'll understand why I think all of you, if you wanted to be on this webinar, you should get this book. And I'll just give you a little sampling. In the prevention section, one of the 3 main sections, to make the point that you not only have to say we don't tolerate cheating, you have to be convincing. You have to be clear, you have to be consistent, you have to emphasize that frequently because everybody says they won't tolerate cheating. You have to be convincing that you really mean that. You are not going to tolerate cheating in your program, and if people insist on doing it, they're going to be sorry. That's a tough message, but you need to deliver it. You need to have a very good, written, reviewed, acted upon security plan. Next slide. We have a large section. I've just picked one thing that I think is one of the key points. Don't do a single data forensics method if you get into that. In the state assessment world, there are places that they're very proud of themselves because they do erasure analysis. Well, I'm glad they're doing that instead of nothing, and maybe a little bit more glad if you're doing erasures and gain scores, but that's simply not enough. Those 2 are not even the top 2 best methods. You need to be doing similarity analyses, comparing pairs and groups of students. You have to do that or you're just not up to date. You're not running a best practices program, and then some form of person fit analysis. Next area that we turn to is follow-up or investigations. I have 2 slides on that. One of the things that you need to do is figure out what kind of evidence you're going to get that will make you conduct an investigation and at what level. Since this handbook is for state assessment directors, the different roles we look at are the state, district, and others. How much time will you allow? And we think it's hard enough to do that you need to develop a model investigations kit that people in schools that are asked to do it can do. And the next slide then talks a little bit about the model investigations kit. What should it include? Make clear what everybody is supposed to do, how they should collect evidence, when you need signatures, what things need to be preserved. Often when the problem is detected and you want to go back and take action, you haven't retained the evidence that you need to take. How do you do interviews? You're not going to suddenly become Jethro Gibbs from NCIS, but you ought to have people who know enough to ask the same questions of every person, or if they vary, to have a reason why they ask the different questions, what to record, what is important enough to follow up on, and then how to develop a report. What are you looking for out of that work? Next slide, please. One reason why I think everyone should get the TILSA guidebook is you can get it for free. I mean, this is sort of a commercial for it, but it's a commercial for something that doesn't cost anything. You can go to the URL on the screen and that we will put up and download your own copy. Or if you like, the fancy print version, soft copy thing, you can buy it from Amazon for $3.59. And again, no one is profiting from it, but a lot of work went into this on the part of state folk, and John Olson was the senior editor. I'm the junior editor. That's my new career, junior editor of stuff. So those are my slides. Are you going to pick up again now, Steve?
Yes. No, I'm going to run a poll. And then, so we want to launch a poll and ask, were you aware of either of these resources, the Handbook of Test Security or the TILSA Guidebook? And just gain a sense of if you weren't aware, hopefully now, hopefully you are now, and maybe these can be useful to you. So I've got this poll open. Looks like 3/4 have responded. I've had the poll open for 30 seconds. Now 80%, I'm going to close this. And I'm going to share the results. And John, this is a peace sign. It's 33% were aware of both, 33% were aware of one and not the other, and 34% were not aware of either. So we, absolutely equal for the three options.
Great.
Now we'll hide that. Were you going to talk about social media?
Yes, but I wanted to close off that section. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself, Steve. As Steve knows, and some of my colleagues, I made a very foolish mistake. I should know better. I agreed to accept a new version of Internet Explorer this morning, version 11. And if any of you get that offer, I would strongly advise you to turn it down, because you'll suddenly be looking at screens that don't look anything like what you're used to and know how to do. And I've been recovering since then. So we have the social media screen up now.
Yeah, and just before we go on, John, before we wrap on those two resources, we've got a comment from one of the participants, Kathy Moore. She said she's read both of these cover to cover and highly recommend both. They're informative and thought-provoking. So that's a nice testimony for the usefulness of these. We certainly agree, Kathy. So now we'll put those two resources aside and talk social media. And we've got that slide up, John.
Thank you so much for that comment. I really value it. So there was quite a bit of evidence at the EATP conference of the importance being attached to social media. And I got introduced, actually through Steve, he's the one that heard it and shared it with me and others, that what you need to do is have a global approach. It's kind of jargony, but you need to be both global and local. If you're running an international program, you better be looking in a lot of countries about what's going on. But you ought to be looking close to home also, because some of the problems you run into are likely to be right within your city or state or program for that matter. And one of the things that turned up at that conference, which you could pick out of the general press, is the growth in users in the testing world as elsewhere continues to be quite large and more international. Next slide. One of the sessions is what it's called an Ignite session. Some of you may be aware of those, that they really put you on the spot. You get up and you have like 7 minutes to talk, and then people can throw things at you. One of the really good speakers was from Pearson VUE, Matthew Koyaji. I may not have done his name credit. He said, you need to do 3 things in order to either not have or deal with a social media crisis. You need to be policing what's out there on social media, talking about you, your test, and your program. And you have to be willing to take action if you find something that's trouble. Don't just take note of it. Get right on it. Don't let people be talking about your program without getting into that conversation and saying what you believe is the case. Not let people misrepresent what you are actually doing. But he also advocates a proportional response. What are they saying? How important is it? How widely is it being distributed? If it's going everywhere, you better be out there too. If it seems to be very contained, someone's saying bad things in a very limited space, no one seems to care, you might elevate it or escalate it if you got into it. He made the point that from research that they've done through Pearson VUE, and which seems to hold up, is customers in general are expecting you to respond in 1 day. But if you look at what typical response times are, only 1 out of every 5 of your customers are getting that. So that's not easy, 1-day response, but he's advocating through social media and everything else, respond in a day. Last slide on this topic is the summary that Matthew gave. Decide where you want to spend your time. Is it LinkedIn? Is it Twitter? Is it Facebook? Is it something else? And make sure that everybody who's going to do that on your behalf, if you're a small agency, it might be a person. Larger place, it might be a group. Make sure that you have guidelines of what they're supposed to do. Guidelines they can follow that are practical and sensible. And then whoever's going to do it ought to be trained. I've been spending 2 hours a day on social media for a number of months, and I still think that there's more that I don't know than I do know, so get people trained. Be proactive. One of Matthew's things was, okay, you're not on Twitter, get on today. Start sending messages. Don't think about it. I don't know how he reconciles that with make sure you're trained, but he gave both messages. Be trained and go fast. And then track what you find and look for patterns. Are people paying attention to things that you weren't aware that they are paying attention to? Is everybody worried about some feature of administration or test content, whatever? This is tremendous information you're going to get. And then his final advice is you're dealing with people. Be personable, be thoughtful, be nice. So let me leave with that. Be nice is a nice rule.
Excellent. So thank you, John, for sharing your thoughts on 2 of 4 important test security resources and this, the emerging importance of social media. We've got a kind of a break. I'm going to start talking now, and so if there are any questions on what John covered, I see that one person's got a technical issue. Skylar, I wonder if you can try to respond to that, please. And so let's keep going, Michelle. Next slide. So I had the unique privilege of participating both in European ATP and the Conference of Statistical Detection, and I want to share some of my key takeaways and lessons learned. So starting with ATP, John talked about the Test Security Handbook and the Guidebook. There were 2 other really valuable resources shared at EATP, and those were the ATP CCSSO Operational Best Practices for Statewide Large-Scale Assessment and International Test Commission Guidelines for the security of examinations, tests, and other assessments. And so a couple of things. All 4 of these resources, we're going to sort of beat the drum. Best practices, guidelines, these are great tools to arm anybody with standards, best practices, and guidelines to better improve security. I want to start with the ATP CCSSO best practices. Next slide, please. So this project actually started way back in 2006. And sort of unprecedented where two very discrete organizations partnered with an audience, state assessment leaders, and said, what can we do to improve everybody's program? And so at that time, ATP CCSSO state leaders built a very broad, comprehensive suite of operational best practices. And this is not just related to security. This is soup to nuts how you operate a program. Everything from vendor selection to item design, test development, administration, scoring, just everything. And the goal was to improve the quality and accuracy of test results, and in doing so, ensure better public confidence in the use of these statewide large-scale state assessment programs. Next slide, please. So initially, the standards or the operational best practices were published in 2010, and those focused just on paper and pencil. So immediately, a rewrite was undertaken that was just published in September to also include computer-based testing and online testing. And I think it's interesting, the publishers, ATP and CCSSO, indicate, hey, these may not be precisely applicable to every program out there, including international programs, but these are going to give you an excellent framework from which to build your own best practices. And both organizations fully support and endorse other organizations using that. So next slide. Again, we have no stake in this. We just think this is a great, great resource, and it's available to anybody. If you're part of CCSSO, it's free. If you're not, I think for a reasonable amount of $30 to have best practices for every aspect of program operation is probably worth considering. So next slide, switching gears, moving from the CCSSO operational best practices, ITC, the International Test Commission, is about to publish their guidelines for security of examinations, tests, and other assessments. Now, this initiative started several years ago in 2008 when the head of ITC's Research and Guidelines Committee requested, hey, we need to do something around test security. Now, ITC has a pretty rich history of publishing guidelines on different areas of testing. It was time in 2008 to focus on security. A couple of years later, 2010, the initial draft was reviewed. The draft has been iterated upon. Now we expect these guidelines to be published either next month before the holiday or in early 2014. Next slide, please. And so I want to talk a little bit about the goals and then the audience, who should consume these guidelines, and kind of the value prop. Really the goal is to share best practices to promote better overall security of any high-stakes test program. And in doing so, defend the value of the scores. So it's very similar to what we saw with the ATP CCSSO goals and purpose. Now, next slide, please. These guidelines are designed to be very broad, to be used by any high-stakes program in any area of testing, whether it's certification and licensure, education, admissions, higher ed, IO, designed to be used by different stakeholders, users, test publishers, vendors. And again, to focus on the entire life cycle of assessment But here it's different than the last resources because it's only from the focus of security. But we think this should be, we're eager to see the final published guidelines because I think it's going to be very useful in this way. Let's go to the next slide, please. These guidelines focus on 3 different areas. One, what are the risks to the security of our program? What can we do about those risks? And then as an industry, as an international community, can we build a common language, a nomenclature around test security threats and the things we can do to mitigate their impact? So that, next slide, please. That wraps up the discussion of 4 very useful resources that are now available or will soon be available to all of us. And I think it's very much a case of a rising tide lifts all boats. I want to talk about something else with the EATP. This was really interesting for me. The concept of electronic badging was somewhat new to me. And Jaron Schmidt from Pearson VUE presented a session. He's a bright young guy. I've seen him talk on social media before. But this concept of electronic badging, essentially, think back to your days in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, and when you earned a merit badge, which was a validated display of accomplishment or a skill or a quality that you earn. Well, that's essentially what an electronic badge is, except it's in a digital form, and it's something that's easily kept with you. It becomes part of your electronic resume. It becomes part of your LinkedIn profile. So you can think to have something that I've earned, like an accreditation, become part of my electronic profile becomes very convenient. And so what I think is interesting is we've got these badges. I think we've got an intersection looming right in front of us. Big industry players, big certification and licensing programs are pursuing badging, as are different vendors. And I think there's this intersection, even a collision, that's about to occur between badging, certification and accreditation, and testing. And I don't know what this is going to look like once the dust settles in the next 12 or 6 or 24 months, but I think it's going to be really, really interesting. So for me, this notion of electronic badging and what it means to us is very, very compelling. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to share about EATP is that the important work from the ATP Security Committee that was started last February with a hands-on lab at the Innovations in Testing Conference continues. And 2 primary takeaways for me. One, the results of this year's annual security survey are now available. Those are available for free to any ATP member, and I think not very expensive for non-members, but this is a very broad, deep, comprehensive survey of test security issues from dozens of small and large certification and licensure programs. Very revealing to see what, as an industry, we're dealing with on the test security front. Also, at the session, there was this hands-on laboratory where we got to actually play with some of the new technology tools that are making it easier and easier for test pilots and test chiefs to gain unfair advantage. And I'll tell you what, the technology continues to get smaller, more powerful, harder to identify and see, almost invisible to the human eye. So it's getting easier and easier for the bad guys to perpetrate test fraud, and harder for us to keep up. And I think that means we've got to see more technology innovation in detecting the use of these tools or inoculating and protecting our exams from their impact. So, yeah, the march continues. It just gets harder and harder for us all. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to, oh, I see a question. The electronic badging session was at European ATP, and if I said ITC, I was mistaken. So that wasn't European ATP. And the slides from the session are available on the EATP website. I'm not sure if we've got other questions right now. We'll want to switch gears from EATP and move to the Conference on Statistical Detection of Potential Test Fraud. So a couple of things about this conference. First, this is a gathering of statisticians and psychometricians from academia and from the testing industry, the private industry, to gather and share really bleeding edge research along the use of statistics to detect test fraud. This was the second annual conference. The first one occurred 18 months ago in Kansas. This one, we want to give huge kudos to Dr. Jim Wallach and his team at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, because, as you can imagine, his team is very busy conducting research and teaching, and to take on putting on a top-shelf blue ribbon event like this year's conference. Jim, thank you very much. Great job. Next slide, please. So for me, last year, I was sort of astounded. I wasn't surprised, but I was very gratified that we had arrived at the place that last year's conference occurred. It was very groundbreaking. This year, I was more taken by the growing momentum in this emerging field of expertise. We've got a conference in its second year that is supported and manifest through the efforts of leading universities and premier test programs and organizations. The attendance grew significantly from last year. There are a collection of papers from last year being published already. Plans for next year and for the years beyond those conferences are already being planned. And I just heard a rumor the other day that there could be a scholarly journal emerging out of the Conference of Statistical Detection of Potential Test Fraud. And so while on the one hand, I'm impressed by this momentum. Next slide, please. I guess I shouldn't really be surprised because of these dynamics that we're all contending with. I mean, of course we've arrived at the place where this conference is so important because testing is growing. We all know that, and it's not growing slowly. For many of us, the stakes rise ever higher. We use the results from these tests to make such important decisions that natural step, and John alluded to this when he talked about predictions. If you're making important decisions based on the results, how could you not take the next step of running statistics to ensure this is a trustworthy test result when the research indicates that the statistics are valid? And that's really what this conference is demonstrating. Next slide, please. So my last point, it's clear there is great innovation, time and effort extolled on the use of these statistics. And I think the next step, I think where we're moving next and what we'll see the industry focus on next are the policies and procedures that wrap the use of these statistics to ensure that they are administered fairly, consistently, and in a legally defensible manner. So as a non-statistician, non-psychometrician, who attended both of these conferences last year and this year, and both of these being the conference on statistical detection, those are my primary takeaways. And so I thank you. And we will turn things over to our Chief Scientist, Dennis Maynes, who was really right in his wheelhouse at the Conference of Statistical Detection.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Dennis?
Yes. Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the lead-in, kind words. So it was a great conference. I attended last year's conference and this year's conference. Next slide, please. So it looks like we have a poll.
Okay, sorry. I'm getting behind myself. Let's launch this. Here's the question. Which of the following methods of statistical detection do you currently employ in your test program? So let's see what kind of reactions we get. People are just beginning to vote. We'll leave it open. Got about half the participants responding. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds. If you don't mind, please just click on an answer. Let us know where you're currently using these kinds of tools. We've got about 3/4 of the participants voting. Dennis, I'm going to close this and share the results. And it looks like similarity. Go ahead.
Yeah, those are very interesting results. So a lot of people are using some of these methods, and about, what, a third are not using any. And other methods are being used besides these. That's very illuminating, and that's good. We believe that these kinds of methods and detection routines and techniques will be used for all testing programs eventually. Then you just, well, given today's test fraud environment, you cannot ignore this. Okay, next slide, please. That slide.
Okay, so I'm going to run the slide from now on.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Apologize for that slight delay there, folks. So I'm going to give you just an overview of what we saw at the conference. I'm not going to talk about specific sessions in detail. And then I'm going to editorialize a little bit. And at that point, once I do that, you say, well, we're not sure if we agree with Mr. Maynes. That's okay. It's your right to agree or disagree. But on Friday, so the conference was about 1.5 days. On Friday, we had general sessions where everyone was involved. And there were 3 general sessions, and within each session there were 4 or 5 presentations and discussed. So we were there for quite a few hours listening. Each presentation was about 15 to 17 minutes long. So not a lot of time. And each of the people came prepared with papers. It was very good. And in the evening we had poster sessions, each of which by themselves merited a paper. It could have easily been part of the main presentations. There was so much interest in the conference. And then on Saturday there were parallel concurrent sessions. So the group split into 2 basically, and at each time there was 3 groups, 3 sessions. And that was also very interesting. So there were like 4 presentations, and the very last session was a symposium, and then a little workshop type of a presentation, actually a fraud detection challenge. there were over 120 researchers at the conference. That's great. Definitely research focused. Let's move on to the next slide. And so here's some of the topics that were covered. These are the big topics I pulled out of the program. There were papers on similarity analysis, person fit statistics, detection of pre-knowledge, brain dumps, item compromise, using unusual gains to detect potential test fraud, robustness of the statistics against contamination by cheating. There was a section devoted just to erasure analysis or test tampering. And this year there was a session devoted to computer-based testing. Primarily, the papers in that session talked about using response times. And can you use response time and how fast individuals are replying to the questions for detecting potential fraud. There was a session on policy, and I think that we will see more of that in the future. At the very end of the conference, there was a test fraud detection challenge. That was a session that I organized. We had a lot of fun with that. And there was a security planning session. So these are all very important topics. You can see that a lot of people are engaged now, putting effort into a wide variety of areas, focusing on this cheating problem and test fraud problem. Next slide, please. So it was more varied. It was global. We had attendees from all over the world. I think they said 12 or 15 countries besides the United States and Canada. And you can see from the list of topics that it's expanded its reach, focus, and attractiveness. That's great. Next slide, please. So, okay, not going to editorialize. I perhaps should really talk a lot about specific papers that they kind of blurred together for me. I hope you appreciate that. So these are takeaways I got after listening to the papers and thinking about it. In order for this field to progress, we are going to need to have some data sets. If you want, let's call them benchmark data sets, where we can take specific kinds of techniques and use those on the data set to characterize how well these techniques work. We can begin to compare the different kinds of methods that are being proposed. Another area is we have, and this conference is very much research-oriented. So a lot of things that are being created, ideas being explored, to take those ideas and pull those back into practice, though, there's going to have to be some bridge work. And one of those will be to accept some standards for measuring these methods and for using these methods and for making inferences about potential test fraud. And some guidance on how to use these, how do you implement them. So these are areas where we're very much needing to improve upon and progress. Next slide, please. And so my observation is generally the current state of research is you have some individuals, maybe some organizations who are sponsoring research that are all working more or less independently on different ideas. That's generally how a lot of research happens. But there's not any coordinated research agenda, and there's not a lot of cross-fertilization. People sharing ideas and saying, okay, well, let's take this piece from that particular research and this one. I actually picked up some ideas from the conference I think are going to be useful in our research here at Caveon. And I think that that's one of the purposes of this conference, is to start to create that environment for cross-fertilization. Next slide, please. Greg Cizik presented the keynote at the conference. And I wish I had his slides and we could talk about all that he shared. He talked about where the field has been, maybe in the initial stages. Then in the past 10 years, things that have changed and where he thinks the field will change in the next 10 years. And one of the things he said, and he said it before, and that is we need to look at test security as an issue of validity, not behavior. So I'm going to editorialize. I personally agree with that this is not a behavior type issue, that this is more an issue of are the scores correct? Are they trustworthy? Are they valid? And I think what we are going to see is the industry moving more in that direction and saying, oh, we can use statistics for determining whether the scores are valid. I mean, this not worrying about what the behavior was, the results in the anomalies we're seeing. But we'll see where it goes. Well, next slide, please. So just my personal observations here. There's some things that are working really well, that have been studied more extensively than others. And I would put in this class two things: erasure analysis and answer copying statistics. Definitely, if those apply to you, you should be using them and aware of them. Let's go forward. And these are techniques that do not work well. It just means they're not as researched as thoroughly as other areas. So definitely a main focus of the conference was detection of item compromise. A lot of papers were focused on how can we detect when people are using compromised content, which items have been compromised, who is using the compromised content, how does it happen? So this is very much an emerging area. And using gain scores. For years, gain scores have been used, but it's been more of an ad hoc basis. I think now we're beginning to see, we saw this in the conference, more targeted research of how well gain scores can be used. And definitely more research is happening on response times for computer-based testing to detect potential fraud. Let's go forward. So these are my observations, my list of 3 takeaways in terms of challenges the practitioners are facing here. Not researchers, but eventually we want to do the research and bring it to practice. And that is using statistics to validate test scores because the scores are not valid. It's very much out there when you read the newspapers and you talk to people that, oh, you just tried to say I cheated, and deciding this is an issue of behavior. I think practitioners are going to have to deal with this in messaging, in communicating, and in policy, and making sure that this is appropriately used. Conducting investigations, and John talked about this, the difficulty with detecting potential test fraud is there are no missing persons, there are no broken doors, there are no misappropriated funds. It's just not obvious that there was bad behavior. All we have usually are statistical anomalies. And so how do you go about taking an anomaly and putting trust in it and deciding how to do the investigation? That's a challenge the practitioners face. Let's go forward one more. I think I have one more challenge here. And this challenge, I think, is really critical also. And that is that we, as an industry, need to demonstrate the science that's behind what we're doing, making sure that these methods produce reproducible results, that we can defend the reasoning, that we're using solid ways to measure just basic science. We need to show that we have the science here, including reporting false positive rates and false negative rates, or what we would call type 1 and type 2 errors. Those are very important to know what those are. Let's go forward. So I think that's my summary and my editorializing on the conference and what was there. Thank you. Turn the time back to you, Steve. Hello? Well, please.
I was on mute. I was talking away. I wanted to say that brings us to the end of the slides, and we do always strive to keep these under an hour. But we've got John and Dennis available if anyone has any questions on any of the things that have been shared from EATP or the Conference on Statistical Detection. So please feel free, and if we don't, then we can, as Dr. John Fremer likes to say, we can declare victory, declare success. So thanks everyone for attending. We hope this has been informative and helpful. Again, we're going to send out links to where the slides are available. There were a lot of really good links shared, helpful links, so you'll have access to those. If you have colleagues that you would like to view the session, the recording will be made available. We'll invite people to comment on our LinkedIn Caveon Test Security group and go from there. I think there was one question, Dennis. Any statistical work on detecting content loss versus cheating?
So yes, that's an area I call it item compromise. And one of the session I organized was a test fraud detection challenge. It was actually involved a program where we knew the content had been stolen. The test had been republished with some new questions, and the researchers, we had teams, so it was a kind of a bake-off. It was rather fun. They were all tasked with identifying the items that were newly published, separating those from the items that had been compromised, and then they were tasked with also identifying the number of people who were using the compromised content. They used a lot of different methods, so it's very much an area of emerging research. There's not any particular method that is necessarily gained, let's say, been declared winner or is really in the front-running position here. And there were a lot of other sessions on this too, a lot of other papers. So yes, there's a lot of work being done here. It's a very hard problem.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. We've got some people thanking us. We've got some people asking about letting them know when the slides are shared. So we will do that. And Dennis and John, I thank you both very much for taking time to share your key takeaways from these very important industry events.
Thanks, folks, for coming.
Yes, thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.